Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with how long can Trump and Hegseth use up $4 million interceptors to shoot down $20,000 drones in an asymmetrical war that Iran just has to stay in, while we can only win at a price we are unlikely to want to pay. Joining us is Nicholas Heras, Interim Executive Director at the Middle East Policy Council and a Senior Director for Strategy and Innovation at the New Lines Institute. From 2016 to 2017, Nicholas served as the 10th First Lieutenant Andrew J. Basovich Jr. USA Fellow at the Center for New American Security, and he has conducted an extensive study on Iran's proxies in the Middle East for the National Defense University. Then we'll speak with an Iranian scholar who was imprisoned and interrogated by Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps to get an understanding of a brutal regime based on divine legitimacy from which the Iranian people desperately want to be freed but have no power to do so. Joining us is Kian Tajbakhsh, an Iranian-American scholar, social scientist, and urban planner. He has taught at both American and Iranian universities and is a presidential fellow and lecturer at Columbia University's Committee on Global Thought and a professor of urban policy at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and a visiting professor of international relations at New York University. In his advocacy for democracy and human rights, he represented the Open Society Foundation in Iran during the 2000s, and his commitment to pro-democracy efforts led to his arrest and imprisonment during Iran's Green Movement protests in 2009. He was one of 5 Iranian Americans held in Iran whose release was negotiated by the Obama administration as part of the Iran nuclear deal, and he was finally permitted to leave in 2016. The author of Creating Local Democracy in Iran, State Building and the Politics of Decentralization. He has an article at The Dispatch we will discuss. What is the Iranian theocracy's future now? Then finally we'll examine a lawless world Trump is plunging us into based on force and subject to his whims, and speak with Oona Hathaway, a professor of international law at Yale Law School and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She has been a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law for the Legal Advisor at the United States Department of State since 2005, and from 2014 to 2015, she took leave to serve as a special counsel to the General Counsel at the United States Department of Defense, where she was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Award for Excellence. The co-author with Scott Shapiro of The Internationalists, How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World. She has a recent article at Foreign Affairs we will discuss, A World Without Rules, the Consequences of Trump's Assault on International Law. And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part delivering a daily public service providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Nicholas Heras, who's the Interim Executive Director at the Middle East Policy Council and a Senior Director at the New Lines Institute. From 2016 to 2017, Nicholas served as the 10th First Lieutenant Andrew J. Basovich Jr. USA Fellow at the Center for New American Security, and he's conducted an extensive study on Iran's proxies in the Middle East for the National Defense University. Welcome to Background Briefing, Nicholas Heras.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, and I'm wondering whether we are watching an example of asymmetrical warfare, because there's no question that the U.S. has military superiority, even in a global sense. But the question is whether this long-term U.S. military superiority doesn't guarantee short-term political and usable success, which is what this war indicates, in the sense that it's an asymmetrical war. And just an example, Nick, would be that the Iranian drones that are showering down on Israel and the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, they cost $20,000, and the interceptors trying to stop them cost $4 million. So how long can we keep that up?
Well, Ian, this is ultimately, and no pun intended, the billions dollar question, right? And fundamentally, the Iranians made the calculation that they would not be able to match the conventional military hardware, planes, etc., or for that matter, standoff weapons such as ballistic missiles that the United States and its allies, especially Israel, could bring to the fight. So instead, what Iran has focused on is a sort of steady operational tempo of using lower cost munition types, whether they are so called suicide drones or lower level, lower grade ballistic missiles to wear down the defenses of the US and its partners in the region. And, ultimately, the question before the Trump administration isn't one of stockpiles, although that's important. The Trump administration will have to weigh carefully whether it wants to continue a conflict where, yes, it has escalation dominance, and yes, it can draw from a global supply of munition stockpiles. But fundamentally, by continuing the conflict, especially for weeks and months, it could lead to catastrophic global effects, as well as the attrition of the U.S. force posture in the Middle East and significant destruction potentially to key U.S. partners and allies.
But isn't there, again, going back to the asymmetry, Iran doesn't need to win this war. They just need to stay in it, right? Because the political pressure on Trump, particularly with the rising price of oil, etc., his own base, who he's promised no forever wars, they're getting more and more upset. I don't see much staying power. My fear, Nick, is that he's going to declare victory no matter what kind of a mess he leaves behind.
Well, the Trump administration hasn't been always clear, to your point, Ian, about what its objectives are. Are the objectives to pressure Iran to make a nuclear program deal that the Trump administration deems to be far better than what former President Barack Obama achieved in 2015? Is it to destroy Iran's stockpile ballistic missiles? Is it to overthrow the regime? Is it to create a new regional order in which Israel is secure and key Arab partners work closely with Israel so the United States can then pivot to East Asia and confronting China? Unfortunately, there hasn't been a clear sense out of the Trump administration what its objectives are. And to your point, Iran, or at least as we know now, the leadership in Iran, despite the immense pressure placed upon it, has been able to articulate a relatively clear strategy, which is, as you put it, survive, but not only just to survive, to essentially cause attrition to the United States' position in the region, and thereby to undermine Israel, because to undermine the U.S. position in the region, you're undermining Israel's attempts to create a new sort of regional order that secures Israel and also minimizes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the issue of what to do about Palestine, which is becoming first and foremost in the mind of the Arab public since October 7, 2023, and all the horrific consequences that have followed that.
Well, it seems to me, though, the worst possible outcome, and this may well be what we're stuck with, given that one of the many excuses has been the need to stop Iran's nuclear program. Isn't it possible, Nick, that, for example, the supreme leader who was just killed on the first day of the war by the Israelis, I think, along with Moshtaba Khamenei, his successors, mother, wife, sister, daughter, and niece, and he apparently was wounded. I don't know whether he was wounded on that occasion, but the long and the short of it is the previous supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, had issued a fatwa saying that it wasn't religiously appropriate to build a nuclear weapon. So if that's true, I don't see Moshtaba. I think he's going to, and the IRGC, they would tear up that fatwa and issue a new one saying we have to have a nuclear weapon because look who just attacked us and tried to destroy us.
Well, that's where you get to the scenario, Ian, that could become the sum of all fears. Because in that scenario, the United States, Israel, potentially other partners would put forces on the ground to seize nuclear sites. The United States and its partners, especially Israel, can't bomb their way out of the enriched uranium stockpiles that Iran has, which are buried deep under the earth. They can't bomb their way out of the reality that Iran has decades of experience now when it comes to its nuclear program. And if you get to this point where it's the assessment of the United States intelligence community that the new leadership in Iran, whether it's the new proposed supreme leader Mujtaba Khamenei or the increasingly dominant factions within Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that many are saying are calling the shots now, that Iran's new leadership, stressed under wartime conditions, would seek to create a nuclear weapon and then have that nuclear weapon be able to be deployed via a conventional mechanism to strike at Iran's opponents, then you'd have U.S. forces on the ground. And Ian, honestly, based on what we're hearing out of the White House now, and we're hearing out of the Israeli leadership, especially Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, takes us down a pathway where you could have an almost James Bond-like mad dash, or if you prefer, a Tom Clancy novel-esque scenario, where you'd have U.S. and partner forces trying to seize heavily defended nuclear sites from the Iranians and the types of cascade effects that could follow from that. Already we see potential escalation in the targeting of oil depots in Iran, potential escalation in the targeting of desalination plants that could follow, not only in Iran, but also in the Gulf and in Israel, all of which are fundamental to the economies and well-being of these populations in the region. So if this conflict continues, and there's already been a horrific human toll that has followed, but if this conflict continues for weeks and even months, there's going to be an even greater human toll, because the types of infrastructure that are being targeted in this campaign are fundamental infrastructure for economies, for socioeconomic well-being of peoples. And that doesn't even talk about all the pollution that has been entering into Iran due to explosions of oil depots. So there's a lot of long-term human security considerations that have just resulted from the previous week or so of conflict.
But the 440 kilograms, or they're supposed to be more than that, but let's say 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. First of all, you can't store it all together because it's dangerous. You could have a criticality accident. So it's stored in stainless steel containers in small amounts, and it's dispersed. So I don't know how the hell you'd even find this stuff.
Well, the reality is that you would need to have a major force presence on the ground, Ian. And so you see it spoken somewhat in the public discussion around this conflict, but the reality is you can't bomb your way out of Iran's nuclear weapons program. You can negotiate your way to a sustainable sort of situation whereby the Iranians are focused on civilian nuclear program, which was the attempt of the previous Obama administration's negotiations, was the attempt of this current Trump administration's negotiations, or so they have said to us. But when you talk about destroying or seizing Iran's highly enriched uranium, you're talking about a special operation supported by a conventional military operation of some staggering magnitude, Ian. And this is really what's here and what hasn't really been spoken clearly to the American public or the publics of the region, is that this situation, yes, it can get far worse, But it also, if the conclusion is you have to irreversibly destroy Iran's nuclear program and eliminate its highly enriched uranium, you're talking about a military operation several times the scale of what we're seeing right now.
Well, the last time a military operation going deep into Iran was the ill-fated attempt to rescue the hostages by Jimmy Carter. So, my God, this sounds like this writ large, right, on a massive scale. It's just not easy to go into a country that's full of hostile, fanatical people in terms of the 10 to 15% that would die for the regime, and that includes the IRGC and the Basij and their followers. Probably 50% hate the regime, 30% are on the fence, and about 15% are totally fanatical. And no matter how much you bomb them, because of the martyrdom complex, the more motivated they become. So even 10%, you're talking about of 90 million people, that's about 10 million people.
It's a staggering type of military operation, Ian. And, I used some dark humor earlier in our discussion about something out of a Tom Clancy novel. But the reality is that this administration hasn't defined a clear strategic goal for this military operation. They've defined a number of potential goals, all of which require now, at this stage of the conflict, significant U.S. investment, whether in terms of financial investment, military commitment, as well as investment of lives, not to mention the lives of people throughout the region, which should also be first and foremost in calculations. But there's Iran. There's a reason why when previous administrations have, including the first Trump administration, have considered an military operation of the scale, they've walked back from it because of all the known and then unknown cascade effects that could come from it.
Well, Nicholas Heras, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you as always, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Nicholas Heras, who's the Interim Executive Director at the Middle East Policy Council and a Senior Director of the New Lines Institute. From 2016 to 2017, Nicholas served as the 10th First Lieutenant Andrew J. Basovich Jr. USA Fellow at the Center for New American Security, and he has conducted an extensive study on Iran's proxies in the Middle East for the National Defense University. We're going to be station break and back speaking with an Iranian scholar who was imprisoned and interrogated by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps to get an understanding of a brutal regime based on divine legitimacy from which the Iranian people desperately want to be freed but have no power to do so. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Kian Tajbakhsh, who is an Iranian-American scholar, social scientist, and urban planner. He has taught at both American and Iranian universities and is a presidential fellow and lecturer at Columbia University's Committee on Global Thought and a professor of urban policy at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and a visiting professor of international relations at New York University. In his advocacy for democracy and human rights, he represented the Open Society Foundation in Iran during the 2000s, and his commitment to pro-democracy efforts led to his arrest and imprisonment during Iran's Green Movement protests of 2009. He was one of 5 Iranian Americans held in Iran whose release was negotiated by the Obama administration as part of the Iran nuclear deal, and he was finally permitted to leave in 2016. and is the author of Creating Local Democracy in Iran, State Building and the Politics of Decentralization. And he has an article at the Dispatch, What is the Iranian Theocracy's Future Now? Welcome to Background Briefing, Kian, Tajbakhsh.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure, and you have extraordinary and unique knowledge of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, whose member has now been elevated to become the supreme leader, the Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain leader. Now, recently, when Khamenei was killed in his office known as the Beit, the son, of course, Mojtaba, was the gatekeeper to that office. He effectively ran it, and Khamenei was killed along with his wife, Mojtaba's wife, Mojtaba's daughter, and Mojtaba's niece. And Mojtaba himself was wounded, but was he wounded in that strike or somewhere else? And do we know the extent of his wounds?
Well, actually, we don't. I've been listening to the news. We've only seen one grainy clip, a video clip of him speaking after his appointment. But for now, I think that he seems to be fine. I mean, unwounded.
Right. But how long is he going to last? Because the Israelis are targeting him.
I'd say he's a dead man walking. So, unless there is something, the only speculation is that maybe behind the scenes, this was wishful speculation, I think, from outsiders, was that the person who was selected had somehow been contacted or in touch with the Americans so as to be a kind of bridge candidate. But I doubt very much. There are no indications that is the case. There are no indications that there's been any contact. And so I think that he represents the choice of the main military arm of the Iranian regime, the IRGC. And if that is so, then Israel has vowed to target him. There's no reason to doubt that they will try to execute that.
Well, if he's not going to last very long, and Trump did mention that there was somebody they had in mind and perhaps were talking to who was subsequently killed, and then he sort of said there's nobody left to talk to. My understanding is that one of the powers behind the scenes is Brigadier General Majid Hathaway, the head of the IRGC intelligence. Of course, he replaced the leader that was killed by the Israelis about a year ago. But what is the power structure that we know of? I mean, who's running the show? Because even though the Israelis and the Americans are pounding the country and trying to kill the leadership, not just the IRGC, but also the besieged, and even striking local police stations, my sense is that there's a lot of built-in redundancy, decentralization in the regime. But I'd like to get a handle from you, since you've actually experienced the brutality of the IRGC up close and personal, having been imprisoned and interrogated by them. What's your understanding of the power structure that's existing?
Well, I should say that I guess it was one of the few let's say things I did not learn about the IRGC is sort of their internal organizational chart. They wouldn't show that to me.
Of course.
I think I asked for it once, and I mean that seriously once. I didn't ask for the entire organizational chart, but I did ask something which revealed something very important to me. I had been arrested earlier. There had been a couple of officers who had been involved in my arrest and were middle-level intelligence officers. And I had got a sense from one that one had been actually sort of directly a member of the Ministry of Intelligence, which had been the feared secret police of the regime for many, many years. And then I got a sense that another one that was now more directly supervising my case was not part of the Ministry of Intelligence, but was part of the intelligence wing of the IRGC. And I asked them on more than one occasion, so which one are you? Are you from the IRGC intelligence or are you from the Ministry of Intelligence? And he would never answer. And in the end, when I sort of bugged him enough, he kind of looked at me, he smiled. He smiled in this kind of knowing smile and said, that is a pointless question. We are all the same. And
Well,
and he added to that something which was actually even more kind of telling. He said, we're all connected to the same base. And he meant top. There's a word in Persian which could mean, the top or the bottom of the base, but he meant the same core. And that was the office of the supreme leader. And he meant it, it's like, yes, we could be in different organizations, but as far as you're concerned, it doesn't matter. And as far as other people are concerned, it doesn't matter. And I believed him. I believed him. I think that was true. That was irrelevant. So at the apex of the hierarchy sits, and I think I want to just maybe elaborate a little more than has been generally understood. The supreme leader is really more an office. It's an organization rather than a person. And this is something that maybe people have misunderstood or has been misemphasized in the reporting in the last few weeks, which is that the Islamic Republic of Iran has not been a personalist dictatorship in the way in which the Shah was a personal dictator, or in other parts of the Middle East, say. It is much more akin to the kind of one-party totalitarian structures that we saw in the Soviet Union, in the Communist Party, even the Nazi Party, and the Chinese Communist Party. That is to say, it's a sort of one-party state, and it has a military wing in the same way that the KGB was the sort of military intelligence wing of the communists, and the Gestapo and the SS were, like different groups, but they were the muscle of the Nazi Party. And so I think when we hear a lot about the supreme leader and speculation about, well, will the regime change direction if a supreme leader changes? I think that underestimates the level of coherence and level of consolidated, let's say, organization that this regime has. So at the top, it consists of the clerical leaders, the political leaders in the IRGC, political leaders in the main kind of political factions that run the political parties and the parliament and so forth, and then a group of economic elites who are more shadowy and are fully imbricated in these three other elites, but organize a lot of the money and the banking and the financing, a lot of it being clandestine and covert and international, connecting with Hamas, Hezbollah, all these transactional flows of terrorist money, essentially. So if you see as this sort of interlocking group of clerics, soldiers, politicians, and money people, that makes up the totality of the regime.
Well, they're all, of course, the glue is this divine legitimacy that the Supreme Leader claims. And the people believe it. They believe that he talks to God. And the people that interrogated you when you were in Evan prison clearly felt that way. And you were told rather politely that this young IGC guy said to you, the fact that I'm polite to you should not make you think we are on the same side. I want you to understand something very clearly. I will do anything for this regime. And then later on, there was a bang on the steel door in the Evan prison where you were imprisoned, and you were told an important statement was coming from the Supreme Leader, and you were able to listen to it through the cracks. And the Supreme Leader basically said in an unmistakable way that if you repent, you'll be forgiven, talking to the opposition, of course, like you and others. If you repent, you'll be forgiven, but if you resist, the consequences will be extremely harsh. And we've just seen that with the slaughter of the people. So
Right.
if Trump, because of the oil prices and this thing seems like a catastrophe that's just going to get worse, he, I think, is likely to declare victory and no matter how bad it is, and sort of walk away and abandon the Iranian people. He's already done that once recently when he said, warned not to kill the people, warned the regime, and then he said, we're locked and loaded. And when they did kill, Trump said they killed 32,000. He did nothing about it. So my sense is that this could be a catastrophe once the bombing stops, assuming it does. Then the IRGC will absolutely crack down in the most brutal way against the people that cheered from the rooftops at the death of Khamenei. And they have no arms, they can't fight back. And if there were any way to bring down this regime would kill everybody because they know that they will be killed, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I think the point you make about the glue being this kind of divine legitimacy is true. I mean, it's certainly weakened over the last few decades, but I estimate that there is a 10 to 15 percent of the population, maybe reaching to 20% of the population. Certainly 10 to 15% believe in that glue. They believe in that divine legitimacy. And another 5 or 10%, their livelihoods are so directly dependent on that on the the regime that they might as well believe in the divine sanction of the rulership. So that means that in a country of 90 million people, I mean, even 10% would be 9 or 10 million people who are fervently, zealously supportive. They are very armed, they are very mobilized, they're ideologically committed, and that's really dangerous. And so yes, they are still in charge. The other thing, by the way, the that interrogator told me, and it kind of shocked me, but it didn't surprise me because I'd heard it once before, but it did shock me to hear it so directly. And he said that, I said, you guys are like poking the bear, that you're like, you're picking a fight with a very big army, the US. And he said, we are not scared of them. And he kind of shook his body and he said, our bodies are itching for a fight. It was hard for me to actually process that. I mean, could it really be, or was it just bravado? No, they mean it. Years ago, people said the IRGC are actually no longer very ideological because they have their fingers in so many different economic pies and they are really just sort of like getting dumb, fat, and happy with economic contracts and corruption. And at the time, I said, I think you really misunderestimate their zealousness. I said, wait till Iranian body bags start coming back from Syria, and then I think you'll change your mind. And when the body bags did come back from Syria, people did change their mind. They realized, oh, wow, these guys really are committed to the fight, and they're committed to die. For them, it is martyrdom. I mean, it sounds so different from the mindset that secular liberal modern people have that it's hard to take seriously, but they do take it seriously. Now, your point in about Trump is extremely worrying. It's extremely worrying. You I think are completely right to put your finger on that. In fact, it's probably the most worrying thing I've heard today, to be honest. I hadn't really taken it seriously yet because I don't see the military operation being wound down so soon. But it is true that currently we speak with family every day in Iran when we can. There's an internet blackout, there is a communication blackout, but Iran has allowed landlines inside Iran to call out. So with international calling cards, they can call out. We can't call in. So family will constantly call out so that they can tell us that. Now, what they've been telling us is, first of all, in the streets, the Basij, the paramilitary kind of police under the IRGC, are everywhere. They're doing road checks everywhere, and that they've told everyone in the street that if there's any sign of looting in some of the shops, they have orders to shoot to kill. They will shoot to kill. They said we have live ammo, and that's been our orders. So that already puts, I mean, yes, people say, okay, those are looters, but during the brutal crackdown, there were many people in the street who were killed just by being in the street because they didn't hear the warning to disperse, or there was no warning to disperse. So anyway, so the Basij are in charge. They're controlling all the streets. They are arresting many people, and from human rights organizations that I'm in close contact with, there are reports now of tens of thousands of protesters and opposition members and writers and so on and so forth, or any type of group that has expressed opposition, have been arrested. Many have been disappeared, and many are slated for secret executions. So internally, inside Iran, there does not seem to be any loosening of the grip of this repressive regime on the society. And as you say, if Trump does stop the bombing, it'll leave even a more open hand for the regime to crack down and repress and all the people who had been doing something during this period, either sending movies, also sending phone clips, videos from your phone of anything in the street has become made illegal and punished and punishable, and so forth. And so yes, so I think that would be a very bad day for the Iranian people. Although I just would emphasize, even though the military operation is happening now, that's not stopping the regime from arresting and detaining and disappearing people either.
Well, Kian, Tajbakhsh, I thank you very much. I'm afraid we ran out of time, but I hope we can talk again and stay in touch.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to bring some of the voices of people inside Iran that need international help and attention to the attention of your listeners. Thank you very much.
And again, I've been speaking with Kian Tajbakhsh, who is an Iranian-American scholar, social scientist, and urban planner. He has taught at both American and Iranian universities and is a presidential fellow and lecturer at Columbia University's Committee on Global Thought and a professor of urban policy at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and a visiting professor of international relations at New York University. He represented the Open Society Foundation in Iran during the 2000s, and he was arrested during the Green Movement and imprisoned as one of 5 Iranian Americans held in Iran, whose release was negotiated by the Obama administration as part of the Iran nuclear deal, was finally allowed to leave in 2016, and is the author of Creating Local Democracy in Iran, State Building and the Politics of Decentralization. And he has an article at The Dispatch, What is the Iranian Theocracy's Future Now? We're going to take a brief station break. We're back examining a lawless world Trump is plunging us into, based on force and subject to his whims.
آن روز عهدت را شکستی با رقیبان پیمان بستی گشتی اکنون پریشان در فکر تو بودم روزی برگردی با من دمساز گردی از عشقت سخنگو قصه خود بازگو به من گو به من گو
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Oona Hathaway, a professor of international law at Yale Law School and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She has been a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law for the Legal Advisor to the United States Department of State since 2005, and from 2014 to 2015, she took leave to serve as special counsel to the General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Defense, where she was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Award for Excellence. She's the co-author with Scott Shapiro of The Internationalists, How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World, and has a recent article at Foreign Affairs, A World Without Rules, The Consequences of Trump's Assault on International Law. Welcome to Background Briefing, Oona Hathaway.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Oona. And apropos of the article that I just mentioned at Foreign Affairs, A World Without Rules, the article concludes by saying, a world in which the powerful no longer feel the need to justify themselves is not merely unjust, it is barbaric. Operations to kill, steal, and destroy, severed from any claim of right. That world does not have a legal order at all. It has only force, guided by one man's whims. So it would seem that the one man that you, I think, are referring to, if you look back on his first term, his medical advice was to shine an ultraviolet light in your body and drink bleach. And I'm not sure that his military and foreign policy acumen is any better than his medical advice. Is that what we're down to? You've got, in effect, a kind of incompetent tyrant?
Well, I will say that I have been very struck by the fact that this does seem to be a decision that was made really by President Trump and a very small handful of people who he's close to. That the normal processes for making a decision as serious as this have not been followed. So it didn't consult close allies in the region, doesn't seem to have vetted this through all the normal channels that you would vet it through within the US government, so that you would know, for instance, that as soon as you attack Iran, that there are going to be counterattacks on Gulf states in the region. They seem surprised by that. They don't seem to have a coherent message about what they're trying to achieve, which normally you would expect. A military operation of this significance, you'd at least know what it is you're trying to do, but the justifications have been constantly switching and changing from day to day without any kind of coherence. And they have no legal explanation for why what they're doing is lawful. Indeed, it's quite clear that it's not. So yeah, it does seem like this was kind of undertaken on something close to a whim, and that's extremely dangerous.
So the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, at the beginning of this war, seemed, and from what I understand, he was really upset with Netanyahu, and he said publicly that essentially the US got dragged into this by Netanyahu, who was going to pull the trigger unless the US joined. So does this expose a difference? In other words, all of Trump's talk about being in charge, he gets to choose the new leader. Earlier on, he talked about, protecting the Iranian people against a government that was killing them, put the government on notice that he was locked and loaded, but then did nothing about it. So I guess the difference would be that maybe Israel is following the Libyan model, where you kill a leader and then the country falls into chaos. Or on the American side, there seems to be some, kind of almost utopian ideas that out of the rubble we can somehow create a thriving democracy.
Yeah, I think Libya's a good cautionary example here. So in Libya, there was humanitarian concerns, though I will emphasize that was authorized by the UN Security Council. So this was not undertaken on the whim of a single person, but it was similarly, an attempt to deal with the fact that there was this leader who was persecuting his own people. And one has to recognize that has happened in Iran. There's no doubt protesters were unjustly killed. There's been a horrible repression for decades. Those concerns are very real, and one doesn't want to dismiss them. But I think what we learned in Libya is that if you're only willing to operate from the air, which is what was true with Libya and what is true here in Iran, you can destroy, but you can't build. So you can kill, but you can't construct. And so, in the NATO-led operation in Libya, we destroyed the Gaddafi-led government. We didn't kill Gaddafi, but his own people did, somewhat predictably. Here, we've done a kind of decapitation strike. We've eliminated the kind of top layer of the leadership. But we don't have anything in place to rebuild, just as we didn't have anything in place to rebuild in Libya, and it really descended into chaos. Here in Iran, it looks like what's most likely to happen is that Khomeini's son seems to have been named his successor. So it's actually something like the Venezuela model, where you get rid of the person at the very top, but the whole infrastructure remains more or less in place. And the claim that what we're trying to do, one of the many claims that was made about the justification for this, which was the protesters and the repression and human rights concerns, that is going to be thrown by the wayside if they're left in power, which seems quite likely because there doesn't seem to be anybody else really ready to step up. And to the extent there were more moderate forces within the government that were being envisioned as possible alternatives, it appears that they were, quote unquote, accidentally killed. Don't really know the entirety of that story, but apparently some of the people the U.S. had been eyeing as possible new leadership for the Iranian government are no longer alive. And so, yeah, it looks like a total mess, right? I mean, we have no real control over what's going to happen on the ground. We can just blow things up. They've been talking about arming the Kurds to come in and provide some ground forces, but that's really a recipe for total chaos and a mess, and maybe unleashing a civil war, which seems like an even worse idea than everything we've already done. So, yeah, it seems extremely ill thought out. It seems like they didn't really have a plan for day two. And we're all seeing the consequences of that, which is total chaos and, constantly switching objectives and lack of a clear vision about how we get from destroying things to creating a future for Iran that's better for the people who live there.
So the UN Charter prohibits the use of force except self-defense against an armed attack or with a Security Council authorization, as you just mentioned, was the case with Libya. But what do you make of arguments from one of Trump's main cheerleaders in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, who has argued that Iran has actually been at war with us since 1979? And as it happened, Oona, I remember during the hostage crisis, I spoke with the American statesman George Kennan, and he told me that he had advised the Carter administration to invoke casus belli in the sense that attacking and occupying an embassy is equivalent of attacking and occupying a country's territory. But he said the intention wasn't necessarily to pull the trigger and have a war, but to put the Ayatollah on notice. What do you make of that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the argument that we've been at war with Iran since 1979 is bogus. That's just simply not true. It's a kind of post hoc justification for what we're doing now, and they're sort of grabbing at straws. I mean, they're constantly making up new arguments, and this is one of them. It's not supported by the evidence. We engaged in negotiations with Iran. We came up with a peaceful deal to address their nuclear weapons programs, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was actually working really well to address the real threats to the U.S. from the nuclear program. President Trump, of course, chose to tear that up and set us on this path towards confrontation with Iran. So, I don't think that there's any justification at this moment for claiming that somehow we have been at war with Iran this entire time. If that were true, like everybody's kind of at war with everybody else. I mean, that undermines the meaning of war and the constraints on war that the UN Charter was meant to put in place, and it certainly doesn't justify what the Trump administration has been doing.
But meanwhile, the UN Charter doesn't really deal with the slaughter going on in Sudan and Myanmar. And of course, there was a NATO intervention in Kosovo, which was undertaken to stop ethnic cleansing. Where does the Canadian notion of responsibility to protect R2P come into the mix here? It seems to have fallen out of favor after Libya.
Yeah, it did. I mean, look, there's two versions of R2P. One version of R2P is it's sort of a get out of jail free card. You can sort of forget all the rest of the rules. You can go in and unilaterally intervene if you think there's a humanitarian justification. That has never been accepted widely by states. The only state that's really articulated that view is the United Kingdom, which gave that justification during the Kosovo intervention, but nobody else joined it, including the United States. So that is not a widely accepted justification. A second version of R2P is this idea that the states that have the capacity to authorize an intervention in cases of humanitarian violence have a responsibility to do so. So basically, it's an obligation or it's a responsibility on members of the Security Council to act, to respond if there's a humanitarian crisis. This version is a version that Kofi Annan ultimately endorsed. This is the version that I think many international lawyers think of. And this is an idea that it's not an end run around international institutions, but it's a responsibility of those who are in a position to run those international institutions to actually use their power and authority to address a humanitarian crisis while it's unfolding. That version, maybe it somewhat fell out of favor during Libya, or certainly did fall out of favor during Libya, because that was, as I mentioned, a Security Council authorized intervention. And I think what we realized is it's very hard to make the lives of people better if you're not willing to go in and rebuild. So we were not willing, NATO wasn't willing, European allies weren't willing to go in and invest in creating effective governmental institutions to bring the peace and to enable creation of a set of governmental structures that are safer and more secure for the people who live there. If you're not willing to do that, all that you can do is destroy somebody who's bad, but you can't stop somebody who's worse from taking control. And that I think is a lesson that we learned, and I think it's turned out to be a really cautionary tale for most who are deeply concerned about the horrible things that are happening in much of the world. And I participate in a report that's going to be released tomorrow morning that's documenting some of the horrible offenses that have taken place against people in Sudan over the course of the last couple of years. And this is a report that details in very significant detail the crimes against humanity and war crimes, and even acts that could support claims of genocide against people in Sudan that have been taking place. So that's not to diminish or to ignore the fact that there are these terrible acts of violence taking place, but it does mean that the institutions have to bear that responsibility. But you don't want to act outside of these institutions, because then you create a lawful basis for even worse. And that's the problem that we've discovered in Libya, and that I think, unfortunately, we're starting to discover now in Iran.
Well, just wondering whether, given the confusion and the many different rationales being put forth by Trump and his administration, whether or not, and given back that more recently they did, offer up. It wasn't R2P responsibility to protect so much as warning the regime not to kill its own people, and said, we're locked and loaded if you do it. And then when they did kill their own people, Trump did nothing. So I'm wondering whether, as a fig leaf, he could have invoked R2P, because it would seem to me that given the nature of who's in charge now with Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, who's close to the IRGC, if Trump declares victory, pulls out because it's a catastrophe and the price of oil is going to sink the Republicans, then it would seem likely that the IRGC and the Basij will then just go out and slaughter everybody that cheered from the rooftops on the death of Khamenei. And there's nobody left in that country to stop them. And if there were, any kind of rebellion, I don't know how they could do anything because they're not armed. The people, the IRGC and the Basij people, they'll fight to the death, because they probably know that at the end of the day, there'll be no forgiveness of what they've done. So I guess this is a long-winded way to say, Oona, that this thing I think is going to go from bad to worse.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that's not true, but I fear that it is. And what I will say is that Trump administration did at various points, seem to motion towards a concern about the protesters, and we all do remember when Trump sort of laid down this red line and then didn't really follow it up, although then later, obviously used military operations, although again, he's throwing out a zillion different justifications. Sometimes it's the nuclear program, sometimes it's the protesters, sometimes it's we've been at war with them since 79, sometimes it's their missile program. I mean, it's been all over the place, but it seems quite unbelievable that they're really concerned about the Iranian people, because they've not acted as if they actually care about the people who are there. I mean, this horrible bombing of the girls' school that took place appears to have been the United States responsible for it, and appears to have been a double tap strike. So not just once, but twice, getting parents who were trying to rescue their children from the initial strike, which is just a horror. And the Trump administration has been really taking steps to undermine efforts that had been put in place in previous administrations to do a better job of protecting civilians during armed conflict, and putting in place strict rules of engagement that that are meant to protect civilians and to ensure that civilians are not likely to be caught up in the violence in the course of a war. And Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of Defense, announced that he doesn't support "quote unquote" stupid ROEs, which seem to be what he's referring to as rules of engagement that he deems as excessively restrictive. And that is, I think, a real misunderstanding about the purpose of these rules of engagement, and suggests that he doesn't actually care about the civilians who are living there, because he's not willing to take the steps that are meant to protect them from violence in the course of war. So yeah, I mean, they may use it as a justification, as a fig leaf, as you said, but they're not acting as if this is something that they actually care about.
Well, but Hegseth is just dripping with venom and glee at killing people. I mean, the stuff that he says, I mean, it feels like, we've got two really nasty schoolboys playing with war toys in a sandbox. I've never heard such macho bellicosity from any American leader, let alone the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, it's really stunning and upsetting. I worked at the Department of Defense, and I really respected the people that I worked with. I didn't agree with them on everything, certainly, but I felt like people were generally trying to do the right thing and had the right values. And the men in uniform, mostly men that I worked with, were, deeply devoted to international humanitarian law and observing international humanitarian law, and ensuring that U.S. forces were acting consistent with international law, because I understood that that law was important and protected them and protected civilians, and was part of the values that supported the U.S. In its military operations, because what's distinctive about the United States, what they felt was distinctive, what I felt was distinctive, was that we don't always get it right, but generally we're trying to do what's right. And they've kind of thrown that all out the window. They've dismantled systems that are meant to protect civilians. They shut down the Civilian Harm Mitigation Action Plan. They fired a lot of the people who are working on civilian protection, and they seem to be celebrating the idea that we might be committing even war crimes. I mean, of course, Pete Hegseth himself rose to prominence as somebody who was defending those who'd been convicted of war crimes, and thought that the enforcement of international humanitarian law was, making troops weak. So it's not a huge surprise that that's the case. We kind of knew what we were in for, but it's still stunning and so sad to see that from a U.S. Secretary of Defense, given that, I do feel like, generally speaking, secretaries of defense have regarded these rules as important to follow and as part of the values for which Americans were fighting.
Well, Oona Hathaway, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Oona Hathaway, who's a professor of international law at Yale Law School and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's been a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law for the legal advisor to the United States Department of State since 2005, and from 2014 to 2015, she took leave to serve as special counsel to the General Counsel at the United States Department of Defense, where she was awarded the Office of Secretary of Defense's Award for Excellence. She's the co-author with Scott Shapiro of The Internationalists, How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World, and she has a recent article at Foreign Affairs, A World Without Rules, The Consequences of Trump's Assault on International Law. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.